There we go. All right, so yeah, just start from the beginning. Well, it's great to be back in person. I've just started doing these again. And I hope, this doesn't turn into a super spreader event, Jenny, but I'm sure it won't. So we're going to talk today about inflation more than anything else, since those are our concerns, I think, from our intro speaker too. When we think about what are the things that firms are really challenged by in this environment. And I'll call this back to the 1970s. For those of you that remember the 1970s, it's a little history lesson there too. But I don't think we're really moving back to the 1970s, but there's a lot of interesting parallels with the economic environment at that time. So yeah, I think it's really worth the discussion. So it really starts the story with how quickly the economy rebounded from the pandemic. And I don't think this was completely expected in any way, shape, or form in the early days of the pandemic. So the green line here is our estimate of what we call potential output, or what we think the US economy can produce. And the blue line is actual output. And the idea here is that really in a perfect economy, you'd want actual and potential to be fairly well aligned. That's what we think of as generally a non-inflationary situation. Now, our estimate of potential output is just an estimate. You can't go and find it anywhere. Or you can find it, but it's just an estimate. So right now we have considerable amounts of inflation in the economy. So one of the interesting things is this estimate of potential might actually be too high, which is very different than the situation we had after the last pandemic. In the last recovery. In the last recovery, we came out of that recovery, and the idea was actually that the potential output had fallen, perhaps, or was lower and on a lower path, and therefore the economy could not grow as fast. And actually, in the early days of the recovery from the last recession, there were a lot of concerns about inflation. And those concerns were never materialized. Inflation never became a problem. In fact, what our problem was after the last recession was a very long period of weak demand. So it took years really to get unemployment down to some place that we thought was acceptable. And that didn't happen this time. This time was very, very different in the speed of the recovery. And if we look nationally, but in Oregon, it's the same sort of story too, where my index of economic indicators, like after the last recession, fell sharply and then only really climbed back up slowly over time. And then this time had the same picture that we see sort of on the national level. So we had a quick fall and then we went back up fairly quickly. Now, if I could ever get away with this paper, but I don't think I ever would, it would be, did we really have a recession during the pandemic? Is that really the best way to describe it? Typically, we think of recessions as large demand side events, where this was largely like a supply side shock. It was like a giant snowstorm for 2 months. We shut everything down and we started things quickly. And the economy is actually able to rebound from that fairly quickly. And we saw it across a whole variety of indicators. So if you remember the early stage of the pandemic, how quickly initial unemployment claims went up. And there was all this panic because we couldn't process those claims quick enough because the systems weren't set up to do that. And obviously now claims are low, nobody can lay off their workers. Or you can, but then what are you going to do? Employment services payrolls, which is typically a good leading indicator of employment, that fell sharply. This is largely temporary help employers, and then rebounded sharply. Interestingly, residential building activity really didn't suffer. And that's part of the inflation story too, is there was a lot of support for housing during this pandemic and the aftermath. And so residential activity really dipped a little bit, then bounced back. And hours worked in manufacturing has been a challenge system story for a couple of years now. For some reason, the measurements we have of hours worked in manufacturing dipped, but we're pretty much at pre-pandemic levels of that. And then just a couple other indicators that on the local level that will partly tell our story. This is up here, Oregon's weight distance tax. So it's just a measure of trucking activity. And you can see how it spiked after the pandemic and then has recently just started to come back down to where we think of as the trend line. That spike represented in part a real shift in spending during the pandemic to goods away from services, and that's going to be part of our inflation story. And another part of our inflation story is going to be the low unemployment rate. Unemployment rates are almost back to where we were prior to the pandemic. So one of the very interesting things about this cycle is that the things that really are affecting us on a national level are really also affecting us quite severely on a local level. A lot of the same stories overlap. So what happened during the pandemic that's creating challenges for us now, and how does that affect the outlook? Well, not only do we have this kind of supply side shock, which is more like a snowstorm than what the kind of demand side shock we suffer in a typical recession, we threw enormous amounts of resources at that shock. And I don't think sort of the magnitude of the fiscal monetary stimulus we dumped in the system is really widely appreciated. This is current personal transfer payments. So this is money the government's sending to households, and as a percentage of the overall economy. And you can see that during the pandemic, we had months where we're sending checks to households on the order of 30 or 35% of national output. And it far exceeds any type of stimulus we've ever done for the economy. And so the reason we did this was we thought this was going to be a recovery much like the last recovery, which was going to be slow and difficult. So there was a logical point about it. We thought we didn't have enough fiscal stimulus in the last pandemic. Excuse me, I've got to get that straight. The last recovery, we didn't, and as a consequence, we tried to make up for the mistake with this recovery. And then at the same time, the depth of rise in unemployment was much bigger than we saw in the last cycle. So we thought, economists thought that this was a good idea, right? At least the first stimulus. The second stimulus, as it turns out, was maybe a little bit more questionable. And as it turns out, the third stimulus was probably completely unnecessary given what's gone on in the economy since then. The consequence we see, or one of the consequences is how it reflects in our lives and how we operate our businesses, is this idea of economic overheating. Do we put too much money in the economy? And as a result, we're asking too much from the resources we have. And the typical place that we see that kind of overheating is in wages and prices, right? So it turns out either you can't hire quick enough, your employees constantly want higher wages, and prices keep going up, right? So this is some combination of higher wage growth and higher inflation that we haven't experienced in this economy for many, many years. You literally have to have an experience back to the 1980s before you've seen inflationary pressures of this magnitude, which is another thing that nobody thought you could have going out of this recession. It was pretty much at the time of the pandemic, that 2017, 2018, 2019 period, we didn't think that inflation was really likely ever to be a problem again. We were stuck in this very low inflation world. The concern was inflation going to keep falling? Was it going to get too low? Were we going to go to less than, we're going to go to 0% inflation? And all that seems so quaint now that we do have 8% inflation rates on a year-over-year basis. And it's really, these are shocking numbers. It was really the fact that prior to the pandemic, we hadn't thought about inflation. It wasn't something that entered our decision-making process on a regular basis. In fact, right about this time, 2018, 2019, the Federal Reserve did a listening tour and find out what the public cares about. And the public cared about jobs, not inflation. Well, of course they cared about jobs, not inflation. They had never seen inflation. Now, if we did that same tour, guess what they would care about? They'd care about inflation. So we had a couple stories of why we had this inflation. And one story we told about this time last year was it was largely about some kind of supply chain disruption. And this is important because we wanted to tell this as if it was basically a supply side story. If it was a supply side story, it wasn't because we put too many resources in the economy. It was because there was some breakdowns due to the pandemic that prevented us from reaching our full potential. So of course, in this framework, we didn't make any major macro policy mistakes, right? It was all this unexpected supply chain issues. And so this picture, and maybe I've used this for a group before that you've seen, or maybe this group, because it's such a great picture. This is the Port of Long Beach at night, and all those lights are ships out in the ocean waiting to unload. So this is the big story last spring, that really the problem with inflation was not being able to get enough goods. Now, what wasn't really reported is that we were actually moving more goods through the port than we were prior to the pandemic. The port was actually functioning quite well. It was that it was overwhelmed even for a functioning port to how much it could really process. And we saw that play out everywhere. And part of this was because we definitely did have a significant spending shift during the pandemic. During the last recession, what we saw was spending on goods decline relative to services. So the way people behave in the recession in the last recession is they kept doing services spending. So they do leisure and hospitality, for example, and they spent less on goods. And this was completely the opposite that we saw in this last cycle. The last cycle, this most recent cycle, a surge in goods spending. So the story was that there was a big surge in goods spending. And we see that here, if I look at personal consumption expenditures, the black line's the pre-pandemic trend. You see this big surge in goods expenditures. And then this, we haven't caught up in services spending yet, right? So that transition combined with these supply chain challenges was blamed, we said that was causing the inflation. And we had plenty of examples of that. The computer chip example, for example, where we just couldn't build enough cars quickly, right? And it wasn't really about demand. Actually created this weird thing in the data where we had a drop in car sales that you typically only see in a recession, right? It wasn't about a recession. It was about demand. Right? So we also saw it in housing. Right? We've probably been through these stories, and you've seen these stories, so I don't have to spend too much time on them. But housing starts are very high. Housing completions haven't kept up, and the reason for that is that not only was the system overwhelmed, but we didn't really have doors or windows or all the things you need to complete a house. So we had this story that really inflation was just about a supply side story. And so that created this idea that it was going to be transitory or short-lived, right? So if you go back to last spring, everybody said this isn't going to be a problem over the long run. This is something that's going to dissipate over time. And we won't be in the situation that we're in today, where we have these persistent inflationary effects that are affecting how we run our businesses and how we make decisions as individuals. This is just a quote from Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell in March of this year, who was trying to explain what went wrong, what were we doing that caused us to miss this inflationary episode. And what it really came down to was they expected the supply side shocks to ease, and they expected the labor supply to come back quickly. And none of those things happened. Right? And so what happened instead was that we overheated the economy. And this is the part that everybody's being affected by right now in some way, shape, or form, is this idea that we've really started to push the economy harder than we could possibly have imagined. So this is the Federal Reserve's index, or one of the indexes of inflation the Federal Reserve focuses on. And what we were doing last May is we were seeing this big spike in inflation. We said, no, that's going to go away soon, right? That's the transitory thing. And boy, it sure looked like that was the story, right? But then in the winter, it came back, and we had 6% inflation rates on a monthly basis, right? Now, again, prior to the pandemic, we were going about 2% monthly basis, right? Annualized basis. So it's not 2% a month, it's annualized basis, right? 2% was enough that we didn't think about it. 4% you'll think about, right? You'll have to plan for. Your staff will have to plan for. And so this was the mistake. The Fed thought, oh, this is going to happen. In fact, most economists thought this too. So there were very few people out there that were saying last year, inflation is going to be a problem. And the reason was because we basically spent 10 years where inflation wasn't a problem. And so anybody that stuck their head up in the past recovery, it said, yeah, there's going to be inflation. Yes, I'm really worried about that. That was wrong year after year after year. And so we all, many economists, not me, by the way, but of course, right, that would be crazy, right? But many economists have assumed that we just couldn't have inflationary pressures. So it was a very small subset of people that were raising their hands and saying, you know what, this has gone on too long, too far. And it's not just about used car prices. And so one of the stories we tell ourselves is, oh, this is just about used car prices being too high, and you should take that out of the indexes. All right, inflation looks much better. And that's not true. This is what we call super core inflation, or you know what I call super core inflation. I don't know how many people have actually used that term. And that basically takes out shelter. So we know housing prices have gone up, and also takes out this used car truck price. And boy, sure enough, that's at levels not seen since the 1980s too. So even if you dig deep down into the system, and if we look at other measures that show how broad inflation is, that's also been at levels that we haven't seen since the 1980s. So, you know, by the end of last year, by the end of last summer, I was sort of raising my hand and saying to people, you know, we're going to have some issue here because we're running our labor markets too hot, and monetary policymakers are not recognizing it. And this is really what, I mean, basically, you know, right after the pandemic, I started hearing from firms that labor was a problem, right? And that is a core problem in the inflation story. And that's a core problem that hasn't gone away for firms yet. So job openings typically after a recession drop and then rise only slowly. And if I've been giving this speech a year ago and I was using this slide, right? And I said, look at this. I mean, look how quickly, basically by the end of 2020, job openings had bounced back up. And I'd say this is not something that normally happens. This is a sign that this economy is actually rebounding very quickly. And then job openings doubled, right? And that was certainly something you never see in a bad economy, right? So you'd have, on one hand, policymakers saying, boy, jobs haven't recovered. It's really rough out there. And then you talk to firms and say, I can't find workers, right? At any price. Okay? So there's a disconnect really between the policy community and what was going on around on the ground among workers. And the other thing that came up too was this quits rate. So how quickly people were leaving work. So this was another sign that I think policymakers didn't recognize that, you know, by the end of 2020 and into beginning of 2021, these numbers were already coming up to really pre-pandemic levels. And we just kept dumping resources into the economy, just dumping resources in the economy at that point. Held interest rates at zero, continued on with fiscal stimulus, and it was as if these parts of the labor market didn't matter. And the reason was because job growth had not picked up dramatically. And then I'll show you one more picture. This is what we call the Beverage Curve. It's the relationship between unemployment and job openings. And we see typically, this is the relationship we had prior to the last recession. And then the green dots are all basically after the great financial crisis. And we had this story where, well, there was a little bit of a shift, but it really wasn't affecting the labor market very much. All the red dots are what this curve looks like. So basically, for any given level of unemployment, the number of job openings is much, much higher. Right? And that would typically be something we'd see in a super tight labor market, or a labor market where we really couldn't get unemployment to 3.5% again without inflationary consequences. This might be something in the labor market where you can only get unemployment to 5% without inflationary consequences. So if the natural rate of unemployment, the rate of unemployment doesn't create inflation, it's 5%, and we're running the economy at a 3.5% inflation rate, we're going to have a problem, right? It's a problem two ways, right? How do you solve inflation? You've got to get unemployment up. Right? You don't get unemployment up outside of a recession typically, right? And I hate using that word because it gets people all wigged out. But we'll talk about that into the story as we go on. And I have a lot of charts that say the same thing. Job openings are greater than unemployment. Do we want to wait for questions at the end? I can't remember how you want to handle this. Okay. If anybody has a question, they can always raise their hand because, of course, I'm coffeeed up and I'm just going to keep going until Jenny sends me on my way. Another issue that was ignored that was important was labor force participation did not bounce back very quickly. So this was not only were job openings high and policymakers ignored that, well, policymakers thought they could get job labor force participation back up to pre-pandemic levels before they had to do anything, before you had to raise interest rates, right? And did not really recognize that this is typically a lagging indicator. Typically is only deeper into a recovery that labor force goes up. So they kept the job market super hot, lots of demand for labor in an economy where labor supply just naturally doesn't come back up quickly. So again, you have the makings for an overheated economy. And where this shows up for all the firms that I've talked to is either you can't get workers, so you can't meet your production schedules, you can't meet your service schedule, whatever kind of business you're in, or you're paying a lot more in wages. And so wage growth has been, on average, if you kind of look at whole compositional workforce, it's the same, which this indicator does, about 6% year over year wage growth on average. Some workers more, some workers, less, but 6%. That exceeds late 1990s. Anybody remember the late 1990s? Late 1990s were great, right? Great economy. And it was great because this was late 1990s were a lower inflation period. You had high wage growth, but still lower inflation because we thought we had very high productivity rates. We did have high productivity rates. We were making stuff faster because of information technology, like the advent of that whole computer revolution. That's not the situation now. Right? This is just high wages and high wages that feed into high inflation. Those two things are interrelated now. And that becomes a much stickier problem, much stickier inflation problem to get rid of. It becomes a situation where I wouldn't call it a wage price spiral like in the 70s where you had a compounding, but it's definitely the case now where I think individuals, as employees, will have to think about how do you manage the higher cost of living, right? Which you really didn't have to think about. And there's only one way, or there's generally one way to deal with a higher cost of living is you have to make more money, right? And so you either have to get more from your current employer or you have to actively find new employment that pays more. And we don't mind in our economy people switching jobs. We think that that's good for me on average, right? Is that you should be looking for a better job and employers should be looking for better employees. So switching jobs isn't a problem. Switching jobs just to chase the impact of inflation, we think that's a problem, right? That's, again, inflation becoming the driving motivation for your decision-making processes rather than you just trying to get, improve your life. Like you're kind of improving your life, but you understand the distinction, right? And employers have that challenge too, right? They have to figure out, can I pass through these prices, these wage increases to my customers, right? Well, it's easier to do that if you know everybody else is getting a raise, right? So that's where the psychological shift starts to happen, where we all start thinking that the 4% inflation is the norm, then we all start behaving as if it's the norm, right? And then that works its way into all of our behaviors and all of our decision-making processes. And that's what we don't want to see, right? And at the core, why is this happening? It's because people have money to spend, right? That's it, right? I mean, it's the oldest story in the book as far as inflation. But you put enough money out there in the economy and you give it to people that are going to spend it, sure enough, they're going to spend it. So this is a measure of aggregate weekly payroll. So this is hours times workers times pay. And we haven't recovered all the jobs lost in the last recession, but this measure is now above pre-pandemic trend, right? So what that's telling you is that even without all of the jobs being recovered, right, you're above trend, right? So this would be, if you think about what trend means here, is it's adding, 3 or 4 million workers that didn't get added and getting their wage gains, right? And we've made all of that up, plus right? Just on the wage side alone. And what that is, this is wage, this becomes wages and income. So this is, the blue line here is the annual growth in aggregate weekly payrolls, which I don't remember what color. So the red line is wage and salary growth. And not surprisingly, that tracks the green line, which is consumption growth, right? So the core driver of our ability to buy things is our wages, our earnings, right? So prior to the pandemic, our earnings were growing about 5% a year in nominal terms between new workers and wage gains, right? So if you think that there's a 2% inflation rate, right, and you have 5% more to spend, right, that tells you about 3% real stuff you get to buy more every year, right? And that makes sense. That's 3% real consumption. Right? Well, if the economy can only really produce 3% more consumer goods every year, but you're trying to dump 10% growth in spending, well, then you're looking at inflation rates of 7%, right? What isn't come out of actual stuff has to come out of prices, right? And so it's just really a story about having too much money flowing around in the economy, having people earn money too quickly, that money not really being able to turn into actual new goods and services, but instead turning into higher prices. I showed this graph earlier. And one of the stories here is, what if you get the spending shift that everybody talks about? So in this case, people say, well, people are going to spend less on goods and more on services, and that will solve our inflation problem, right? Because it will rebalance the economy. Well, there's two problems with that. One, you can see that services spending is almost already at the pre-pandemic level. So, and I've got a graph a little bit later. If we put those two things together, you're still spending more than pre-pandemic levels on consumer goods. Also, services inflation has gone up as well, right? So service inflation would be, if that's up, right? Well, then your whole story about how you're going to transition away from goods to services doesn't work. You'll still have higher inflation. Another way to see that in all the dynamics I've just explained, this is spending in just dollar terms, not adjusted for inflation. And you can see we're above pre-pandemic trend. Adjusted for inflation, we're bouncing around pre-pandemic trend, right? So that's telling you, again, there's a constraint on the ability of the economy to produce goods and services at any given time. And if you try to spend past that, right, the outcome is just inflation, right? And for the most part, no one really paid attention to this until last December, at least on a national policy level. And there's lots of reasons for that. And again, it really comes down to, I think, basically a massive blind spot in the economics policy community when it came to the possibility of inflation. Just this massive blind spot that said, no, that thing can't be a problem. And I think part of that was because the policy community had come together and said, we need all this fiscal stimulus and we need all this monetary policy. And if the policy, if that community certainly said, wait a second, this was too much, it would invalidate, I think, the policy responses. And so as a result, nobody was really paying attention to this until late last year on the policy side. And really, we were kind of starting to form what we find as a toxic combination. And that toxic combination is revealed here. This is from a Federal Reserve's beige book. So this is the combination of anecdotal evidence they collect before every meeting. And the key here was that firms reported an increased ability to pass on prices to customers. In most cases, demand has remained strong despite price increases, right? So this is, prior to the pandemic, firms would say, well, we can't pass on more costs. Our consumers won't take it, right? We can't raise wages too quickly because we can't pass on those costs because, we're going to lose on our customers. That hasn't been the case this year for the most part. I know that somebody raised their hand and said that their firm is different, but for the economy as a whole, for the most part, firms have been able to pass on these price increases. And they've been able to do it because they don't, in many cases, have a choice, but because consumers aren't pushing back as much as they can. And the reason not pushing back is because they have the income to spend. right? Now that might be changing a little bit in the last couple of months. The last couple of months we've been hit with this extra inflation shock, and I probably have a picture of Ukraine coming up as a reminder that I'm supposed to talk about that. So on the last couple of months, what we have seen is consumers were hit with a pretty big price shock. Amazingly, they've actually been able to spend largely through that because they had a lot of savings accumulated during the pandemic that they've been able to spend down. They still had high wage growth. But one of the things that we have seen is that when they were faced with stress, they did cut back on real good spending. So although in dollar terms, if you look at credit card spending, it hasn't changed or it's still grown. You see all these stories about retailers being suddenly hit with high inventories, right? That's because the consumers were really stretched, right? They couldn't afford the prices, and they were also still shifting their services to leisure and hospitality. So we go into the summer months here, people are desperate to get back on the road again and travel and do those things. They get hit with a price shock, right? They're spending their way through that, but there's stuff going on underneath the surface. So if you went back and thought about one of the charts I did earlier, which was weight miles tax for Oregon, you saw a big surge and it comes back down, right? That coming back down is the retailers now overstocked, right? And you see this across a lot of industry groups, overstocked, and now they have to come back down because that transition is in fact happening. But it's happening on the real side, which is interesting, which means adjusted for inflation. If you look at retail sales last month, they were still on a great upward trend, right? In dollar terms. And again, the stress is in the inflation in the system, right? So I don't need to go through those charts. One of the places that we see this is, well, I should say, I don't know how much time we have. When are we supposed to finish? I have plenty of time, don't I, John? Okay, thanks. Sorry. Again, I want to leave time for questions. Consumer sentiment numbers, right? So you might see the news reports on this, how people are unhappy, right? Best job market in generations. When you walk out the door, you'll find a job. Yet, people are the highest wage growth in decades, right? But people are unhappy, right? Why are they unhappy? Primarily it has to do with inflation, at least the way this particular measure, which is a common one, is used, is it constructed weighs inflation heavily. If you look at the Conference Board measure, that weighs jobs a little bit more. If you just see jobs, people are really happy. But inflation on this measure is really difficult. What you would see in this measure is something of a consumer sentiment level that's closely related to a recession, right? And that started last year, but we haven't had anything like a recession, right? That hasn't happened yet. So that gets your question, is this like a 1970s kind of economy? And I think that's interesting question, 1970s, 1980s, because if you asked Chair Paul what the right historical analogy is, right? If you asked them last spring about this time, they would have said, oh, the post-World War II economy, right? Where we had a big spike up in prices and came down. That's not what they say today, right? Now they say 1970s or 80s. That's the right sort of analogy, right? So that is fairly distressing because that was a very challenging economic period of time. So you really don't want the leader of your central bank to say, this is our real challenge, yet that was what happened. And unfortunately, that keeps getting aggravated, right? So the Ukraine shock, for example, driving up, I didn't have a good picture for this, so this is the picture I came up with, right? Driving up oil prices, driving up global food prices, right? The 1970s feel to this is very much like, in the 1970s, we're kind of hit with these bad supply shocks, particularly from oil, right? So you get hit by a series of them that keeps raising inflation. If you can't get inflation expectations and inflation behavior down, that keeps feeding onto itself. So this, in some sense, that's what we've had for the past 2 years. These bad supply shocks keep hitting, right? Bad supply shocks compounded with high demand, right? So, for example, why are gas prices up? Well, they're up for two reasons. One, oil prices went up, right? But also refinery capacity is stretched. There is no more capacity. We're using infrastructure that we built 30 or 40 years ago. We haven't added new capacity for years. And consequently, there's wider profit margins for energy companies because the capacity is just not there to produce what's needed, right? On the actual production side, it's not that we can't drill for more oil in the U.S. It's that firms were hurt badly. Oil shale producers were hurt badly in 2015, 2016, and their shareholders said, or their bankers said, yeah, we don't want to do that again. So you can't overexpand again. So they're not aggressively increasing energy supplies right now. So those sort of fundamental factors, when you hit them then with taking 7 million barrels of Russian oil off the market, right? That stresses the system, right? So why are we, so there's a supply component, but there's also a demand component, right? We're all driving again. What did I see today? Jet fuel is back up to pre-pandemic levels, right? The amount of that being sold. And I also saw yesterday the producer saying they're stretched. They can't produce any more jet fuel, right? And so we're back up to pre-pandemic levels. We're flying again. We're traveling again. That's the demand side. You then stretch our systems and hit them with these supply shocks, and then the system keeps basically feeding upon itself. And that's the process the Federal Reserve has just really started to try to break. So the way we can think of two big solutions, well, three. There's one group out there that says, well, the real answer to inflation is to increase the supply side, right? Which is a great solution, except for the amount of time that takes, right? So use the refinery, right? How long is it going to take to build a new refinery, right? By the time you find the place, find the materials, go through the EPA, right? And then the refinery operator has to think, well, wait a second, right? People want to drive electric cars in 20 years. What's going to be the demand for this product, right? So it's not so easy just to throw new supply in the market. Housing, right? I've been doing this for like 15, 20 years. I can't do another housing discussion, right? Because housing discussion is all the same, right? We can't make more housing. We can't make it quick enough, right? Same sort of idea. I would love to be able to bring down prices by creating more stuff. That would be optimal. Those are longer run events, right? Longer run events mean that you're just building those inflationary pressures in the system. You're creating 1970s style sort of psychology. And how do you break it? Well, you somehow have to slow demand. Right? You have to bring the demand back into line with supply. And that's tricky, right? That's very tricky because typically the way that happens is with a recession. So then the other way, so there's create more supply, there is make things, reduce demand, and reduced demand comes in two forms, either raising interest rates, tighter monetary policy, or in theory, you could have Congress sort of reverse what it had done, right? It could raise taxes and it could lower spending, right? There is a view out there, modern monetary theory that was out there, and people are saying, well, we should just ignore the Federal Reserve. That should set interest rates at zero always and let Congress just adjust taxes and spending to control inflation. Right? Well, as we're going to see, that doesn't work. That's how Congress does. Congress doesn't do that so any of you remember the candidacy of Ross Perot, right? So you really have to dig deep in your history book there. That's the last time we really cared about the deficit, right? Alan Greenspan was in chair of the Federal Reserve. He told Congress, you do something about the deficit, I'll lower interest rates, right? Paul's not going to do that. Paul's not going to do that same sort of thing. That's not considered what we do, right? So when you come down to, if it's not going to be Congress raising taxes or cutting spending, and it's not going to be the supply side from making more stuff, then it's going to be because the Federal Reserve raises interest rates and makes it more expensive to credit in the economy. And that's what's happened. And we've seen, and there's different ways to look at this, but one of the ways we really look at what the stance of monetary policy is on 2-year interest rates. And you can see they've basically gone from 0 to almost 3%, 2.5%. In 6 months. And that's probably the most tightening we've seen, probably more than in 1994, which was considered a very rapid tightening cycle. So where that plays out for many people, I mean, is mortgage rates, right? That's where people see it first, right? So this is mortgage rates minus a measure of inflation expectations. And we call these real interest rates, real mortgage rates, right? So the nominal rate is what we pay, right? But the money gets cheaper over time, right? Because inflation, right? So you have to account for that. So the real interest rate we pay is what we expect inflation to be. So excuse me, it's the nominal rate minus what we expect inflation to be. In this cycle, we had real interest rates, depending how you measure them, this is looking forward with expectations, down to 0.5%. Right? And that's historically low. That's like saying free money. We're giving you nearly free money for 30 years, right? If you expect inflation to be 2.5 or 3%, and you're getting a 3% mortgage rate, that's really, really cheap, right? So it's not a huge surprise what we've seen in housing markets, right? Housing markets went crazy. Why? Was it just because people are moving into housing to escape cities? No, it's because the interest rate was rock bottom. It was cheap in real terms. And on top of that, there was a strong housing market situation. Nobody was really paying attention to this, well, except of course for me again. Going out of the pandemic, the millennials were transitioning into owner-occupied housing. And that story that was told 10 years ago about how millennials would never want to own houses because they didn't want to be like their parents, that was always a bad story. Always a bad story, because every survey you did of that generation said they wanted to own homes. They just want to own homes when they're 25, like their parents did. They're going to wait till they're close to 30, 35, right? The biggest age group now of millennials is like 38. Right? That's the big age group, 38. So we call elderly millennials, right? That's the big age group working its way through the system right now, right? That age group is doing two things going forward. One is they're going to be buying houses. Two, they're getting their better jobs and moving into the peak earning years, right? So from a fundamental demand perspective, I would say the next decade is great. You've got 5 or 10 years to run out this housing cycle. These are dynamics we probably haven't seen since the 1990s, as the boomers were doing the same sort of thing. And again, the 90s were lit. You remember that? So I guess lit. Can I use that word? All right. Now, so get back to mortgage rates. I got off topic there. Right? I like the 90s. 90s were fine. What we've seen in mortgage rates is they've gone from, what were they? Is there a banker here, right? No, it went from 3% to 5.5%. Right, that's a pretty big swing in a matter of months. Right, that's a huge swing in a matter of months, actually. And not surprisingly, this is stressing the housing market a little bit. So new home sales were reportedly down quite a bit in April, right? Not a huge surprise, given that I don't know what the right interest rate is. Nobody really knows what the right interest rate is that cools the economy, but people have to adjust to this. Anybody's going to get hit with sticker shock. They might be able to afford this. When they see that 5 or 5.5% mortgage rates are the new reality, they might change their behavior, go back to buying houses. They have to a certain extent. Even in the 1980s, remember, when people still bought houses, you paid a 10, 11% mortgage rate, right? For those of you also that remember that era. Whenever somebody posts about complaining about mortgage rates on Twitter, I'll say my first mortgage rate was 7.5%. That'll light people up too, right? I got all upset about that. I'll say, well, how much was your house and when was that? What was inflation? Yeah, like I don't know that, right? But I let it go, right? It's really easy to get people riled up sometimes. We've actually seen a shift into adjustable rate mortgages, and because they're cheaper, quite a bit cheaper, even after adjusting for inflation. And it makes sense to do that sorry, I'm not your mortgage broker, but what it makes sense to do that is because if you think that sometime in the next 5 years you're going to have some kind of event like as growth slow down or something that drives down 30-year rates, you could get a cheap 5-year rate now and then roll it into a 30-year rate later. So I'm sure your mortgage broker can explain that to you. So getting the point, now we know what the problem is. It's too much demand in the economy. We know how we're going to solve it. We're going to tighten monetary policy until we bring demand down. Then the question becomes, first of all, what's the time horizon for that? How long will we be facing these inflationary pressures? And if I was optimistic, I'd say, well, just not too much longer. Of course, that's the trouble we got into last year. It looks to me like sort of underlying inflation is around 4.5%, right? Based on where wage growth is, based where some of these underlying inflation numbers are, maybe 4.5%. We want closer to 2% so we can forget about inflation again, right? If we try to do that by the end of this year, well, that's easy to do. Really, we just create a recession, right? That's how you fix it. And one of the things that I've always pointed out is that if we look at wage growth, right, which is where we really need to get things, this somewhere at the core of our story is getting wage growth back down. That's got to be the core of the story, getting it back down to something in line with productivity. So we need to get wage growth back down to where we had prior to the pandemic, 3.5%, 4%. That can work, right? 6% is probably not going to work. If we hold it this way, we're probably just going to ratchet up inflation expectations like we saw in the 1970s. That's why we had wage growth continue to accelerate in the 1970s, right? This was a period of huge increase in the labor supply too, right? This was as women were entering the workforce, as the boomers were entering the workforce. This is a huge increase in labor supply, and yet wage growth was still rising very quickly. Right? In nominal terms, we had four recessions into the 1980s, right? And wage growth didn't really break. That's the kind of psychology we don't want developing. The way you break it down is, we've always seen wage growth drop along with recessions, right? That has tended to be the major thing. Yeah.
Are we treating wage growth as a shock, or are we treating it as if it is here?
I think it's here, right? So it might not be here 7% or 8%, or what you're paying, what we've been paying warehousing workers, right? But I think, again, underlying inflation is probably close to 4%, and that's consistent with what I think of a wage shock of about 6% growth, right? So it's not the 20 or 30% wages growth you're seeing for, fast food workers, right? But overall, I think it's fairly persistent. And as long as job openings are twice the level of the number of unemployed, right, they're going to stay persistently high. I don't have a different solution for that, right? If you do that, that's not, I don't mean that facetiously. It's just that I haven't found somebody to give me some other story that works. The only other story that works is if you get productivity growth up to 4%. But we're probably mired at closer to 2%, 1.8%. So that's not a story, right? So the only way we really think you can sort of cool these inflationary pressures, because even if they were kicked off by fiscal stimulus, even if they're kicked off by easy monetary policy, once they become embedded, right, you have to find a way to unembed it. And how you do that is you bring wage growth back down to something more consistent. Ideally, what the Federal Reserve wants to do is, well, they look around and say, well, here's the level of, here's the level of job openings, right? Here's the level of people being hired, right? Let's bring job openings down closer to when you're being hired. Then we don't really disturb the labor market, right? We're just taking the froth out of the economy, which is a great plan. I love the plan. I've just never seen it work, but this could be the time it works. How we see that in operation is, so stock prices are down, right? That was mentioned earlier. We're near a bear market, and a bear market would be a 20% decline in S&P, more than a bear market if you look at technology stocks. This was completely expected, completely desired, actually, on the part of the Federal Reserve, and really the idea here is that equities and stock prices were overvalued relative to their likely earnings potential. One of the reasons they're overvalued is because interest rates were out of line with the economy. Once you raised interest rates, investors become risk averse, and they start getting out of some of these names, particularly some of these technology or work from home names. So Peloton collapsed in price, right? And you see the business model can't keep up with these stock prices. Right? So stock prices go down. Now there's a wealth effect. The wealth effect's probably not the big thing to think about. What's the big thing to think about is what does firms do when their stock prices go down, right? They cut costs, right? How do they cut costs? They do hiring freezes, they lay off employees, right? You start to take the edge off the labor market, right? We don't know how much you have to take off yet, right? So is 1,500 workers in Netflix going to do it? No, it's got to be more than that. Widespread hiring freezes, you get job openings down, that might help sort of rebalance the labor market. But you're seeing right now the financial tightening happen. We've seen interest rates go up for housing. That works its way into making housing making housing more expensive to buy, to borrow money for, which means you're not going to have many people doing it. And also, basically, they're going to have to spend more for the house, which means they spend less on other things, right? So it's the whole idea that through these various channels in the economy, we can tighten and create a more balanced economy. Right? Now, is any of that going to cause a recession in the immediate future? Well, there's no data to support that. So if you look at all of the traditional indicators that are coincident or we use for recession dating, all of those are still right. This is I've said this probably in this group, right? The economist's joke is, it's easy to be an economist. Things are good when all the lines are up and to the right, right? That's it. And all these lines are up and to the right, right? And that's what we want, right? We want growing economy. We're in the process now of decelerating from these fast growth rates to hopefully something slower. And if you want to get the labor market under control, you probably have to get unemployment rates up. And that's the really tricky spot. I mean, if you have to get unemployment rates up from 3.6 to 4.2%, right, that's the kind of thing you typically don't do outside of a recession, right? So could it be a mild recession? Sure, right? Does it have to be something that's devastating? I don't think so, given, first of all, the momentum in the economy right now. And then what I always fall back on is, again, that demographic factors that I think are underplayed, that millennial bulge moving into their 40s, right? That's when you start to really make more, right? Your earnings start to accelerate in your 40s and into your 50s. The data always moves that way. That's when you're thinking you're having kids, you're buying stuff, you're buying a house. That's a massive underlying support for the economy, I believe. And so I think that will help. There's probably also been a lot of underinvestment in corporate oil for many years. And I think that'll help. So I don't, there's certainly no recession about to happen. I can't tell you why that should be. I think if it's a story, it's a 2023, 2024 story. And I can't give you a deep recession. I can't give you 2007, 2008. That was a very special recession, right? For special people. No, it was a good deep recession that really was special because it was compounded by a financial crisis, right? But right now, you look around, do this all. I spend a lot of time thinking about this. Is there some reason to think there's a financial crisis growing? And it's hard to find that kind of systemic issues. 2015, 2016 was a good test of that because we really wiped out the oil sector, and wiping out the oil sector meant we really wiped out their bondholders and their banking contacts. And and if there was going to be a problem that was systemic that fed itself in the rest of the system, you'd see it there. You didn't see it. We're not seeing it now either. Even though stock prices have dropped, it's been orderly. We don't know we don't really know what the macro effects of the cryptocurrency phase is, or in that whole thing. I think, it could be bigger on the demand side than we realize, but it shouldn't have systemic issues. But to be honest, literally, I'm hoping to be retired before I have to care about that stuff. So anyway, that's the story right now. The real question is, what do we have to do? How are we going to get this inflation out of the system, and how painful is that process going to be? If we let it go on like we did straight through till 1980, right, in the 70s, that was some painful recessions to get that out of the system, right? Right now, the Federal Reserve has itself positioned where they'd rather cause a smaller recession now to weed it out, to push out those inflationary pressures, rather than wait 10 years to do it. So that's kind of this. We know a slowdown's happening. We just don't know the dimensions around that. So I will finish up there, because I'm sure we're now down to a time that I need to shut up and ask questions. Answer questions.
You mentioned that the workforce participation rate is a bit of a lagging indicator. How much is that still going to come into play?
We should, and I think we are seeing, as time goes on, well, certainly data is moving this way, more and more people re-enter the labor force. Even people that retired have unretired now. So I think that process is going to continue, and it does, as long as the economy continues to move forward. So also, as some people sort of spend away their pandemic, I think it cut me off.
How is that possible?
I do not know. That's okay. As people spend away some of their pandemic savings, then I think there'll be more interest in that. And also, I've noticed psychologically people that have been out of the labor market eventually want to get back in. Retirement is hard when you're 40. So I think there's some of that.
So as the parent of 4 millennials, one of the issues that gave them some more spending money was the reducing the student loan rates to 0. So being my smart kids, they paid off their debts.
Mhm.
So now they have no school loan payments, which made buying housing a whole lot easier. Is this something that we saw pretty broadly, or is this a disparity where you had those in a position could do so, and those who were more had wages and jobs that had less ability, and creating a bigger haves and have-nots divide?
We know that during the pandemic, there was a huge amount of savings that was done. And one of the ways you save is you pay off debt, right? And yes, there's going to be a disparity of people that, we know there's also a disparity of people that are able to take advantage of that, pay off their debt like your children did, and some that are instead hoping for debt relief, right? That would be the other, flat half to follow. And there is going to be a disparity there. And I get the student debt question a lot. And what I can always say about that is somehow these houses are getting bought and sold, even with all this student debt going on. So it's that disparity, I think, that you're talking about, as we lump all these people together as, oh, they're all under the weight of student debt. Well, it's not equally, right? Is there's some people that will have student debt because they become lawyers and doctors, and so they're buying homes. There's others that have student debt, but it's a manageable amount, and there's others that took the opportunity the last couple of years just to get rid of it. The financial positions of households, that's another reason you can't really see a deep recession, is really good. And on average, across the economy, right? And as a percentage of, say, debt service payments as a percentage of income are at basically record lows. Household wealth, even after this decline in equity prices, will be at record highs. I expect home price growth to slow. I don't expect a big rollover in housing prices. Inventories are low, demand is high, building hasn't been able to keep up. And it's an inflation hedge. People buy it because it locks in their payments, right? So I, think, again, getting a deep recession is really hard for me to come around with. Even if you get one, you know, if you get growth rates at 0 or 1%, right, that will feel like a recession to many, but it will not be the worst thing that's ever happened. Oh, but I should say this too: if you are worried about a recession, right, this is the time to get your credit line in order. And so you should see your banker, and you probably could find one here. Do not try to go to your banker when there's a recession, right? And they'll say, well, I haven't seen you in 5 years, right? So, you know, that's the one piece of advice I always give is, if you're worried about a recession coming up, the one thing you can do is make sure you have access to credit going into that, because if you don't, if you go into a recession, you don't have access to credit, you're gonna have a harder time getting it, so. That was complete non-sequitur too, so I just have to remember it. Anything else or any other questions, or everybody want to go back to work?
I think you left them on a good note.
Okay, great,
Soldier anger.
fantastic. All right.
Thank you to Key Bank as well for sponsoring us, and thank you for all coming and getting together again. Couple notes for board members. So for members that are interested in serving on the SEDCOR board, we're currently going through elections, so check your inbox for getting the nominations in. In June, we are not going to be doing our normal business forum because we have this little golf tournament thing that seems to be keeping us kind of busy in the office. So instead, we are connecting with the Energy Trust of Oregon and working with them to co-sponsor an event that's going to be online, but it's a tour of the new Treasury building. And they're going to be doing this kind of virtually with the architect and building team behind it. I'm trying to remember the figures they gave, but the requirement for that building is it needs to withstand, I think, a 9.0 earthquake for a prolonged period of time. It was like 20 minutes or something like that. This is, I'm not an architect, it's built on slinkies. That's the part that I remember about this. It's kind of built on slinkies.
Yeah.
But we'll have information on that on our website. We'll be getting that ready to go, but that should be really interesting thing. And we're happy that the Energy Trust is allowing us to kind of piggyback with them. And as I mentioned, we have our golf tournament coming up June 10th. And our next event like this will be our annual meeting and our awards at the Salem Convention Center on September 14th. So keep your eyes out on our webpage under events, on our Facebook and LinkedIn pages. And I think that's it. So we'll let y'all get back to the office. And thank you all for being here again. Thanks, Key Bank. Thanks.